The sun was setting on a quiet street in a small neighborhood, casting long shadows on the pavement. People were starting to wrap up their day, heading home from work, or picking up groceries for dinner. But amidst the usual rhythm of the evening, something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would change the lives of two strangers in ways no one could have predicted. It was just another day for a teenager walking down the street, lost in his thoughts. Like many young people, he was juggling school, part-time work, and the pressures that came with being a teenager in today's world. Life hadn't been easy. Money was always tight, and it felt like every day brought new challenges. But like most people, he pushed through it all, doing his best to stay focused on what was in front of him. As he was walking, he noticed an older man struggling with his groceries, trying to balance the heavy bags in his hands as he made his way across the sidewalk. The man's slow, careful movements suggested that he wasn't in the best of health, his steps a little shaky and uncertain. For a brief moment, the teenager considered just walking on. After all, he had his own struggles. Who had time to stop and help someone else? But then, something inside him changed. Maybe it was the way the old man looked, struggling and seemingly unaware of the passing time. Maybe it was just a moment of kindness that caught him off guard, but the teenager couldn't bring himself to ignore the situation. Without thinking much, he approached the man and offered to help. The elderly man looked up, his face lighting up with gratitude. His eyes were tired, but there was something kind and warm about the way he thanked the teen. It wasn't just about the help with the groceries, it was about the connection, the genuine human kindness that seemed so rare in today's world. The teenager took the bags from the old man, carrying them the rest of the way to his house. As they walked, they exchanged a few words. The older man told stories about his younger days, about life when things were simpler, about how much he appreciated little acts of kindness. It was an unexpected moment of shared humanity, and for a brief while, they both forgot about their personal struggles. But this wasn't the end of the story. No, this was only the beginning. The next day, the teenager woke up to a surprise that would leave him speechless, a turn of events so astonishing that it would change the course of his life forever. What he had done the day before, just a simple act of kindness, was about to have consequences beyond anything he could have imagined. When the teenager arrived at his usual after-school job the next afternoon, he noticed something odd. A well-dressed man was standing near the counter, waiting for him. His face was unfamiliar, but there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested he was someone important. The man smiled when he saw the teenager, but it wasn't just a polite smile. It was a knowing smile, as though he had been expecting him. "Hey," the man said, extending a hand, "I believe you helped my father yesterday. He wanted me to thank you in person." Confusion spread across the teenager's face. He hadn't realized that the elderly man's family would know about the small favor he'd done. He had simply seen someone in need and acted on impulse. But as the man continued to speak, it became clear that this was no ordinary thank you. "You see," the man said, looking at the teenager with genuine admiration, "my father doesn't usually ask for help. He's independent, stubborn even. But yesterday, something changed. When he came home, he couldn't stop talking about you. About how kind you were, about how you helped him without hesitation. And my father? Well, he's not someone who easily trusts people. For him to say what he did about you, it meant a lot." As the teenager listened, something stirred inside him. He hadn't expected this level of gratitude. He hadn't done it for any kind of recognition, after all. It had just felt like the right thing to do. But now, standing before this man, he began to realize that the impact of one small act of kindness could stretch far beyond what he could see at that moment. The man's words continued, and what he revealed next would leave the teenager stunned. He spoke of an opportunity, a chance that could completely change the teenager's life. A life-changing surprise was coming, one that was tied to that simple, unexpected moment of kindness from the day before. You know, the man said, pausing as if he were choosing his words carefully, my father owns a small business. He's been looking for someone trustworthy, someone with character, someone who can step into a role that's been empty for a while. And after hearing about what you did, I think you might be just the person he's looking for. The teenager's mind was racing. This wasn't something he had ever expected. A job offer? From a stranger's family? But it wasn't just about the job. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond money or status. It was about trust, about the kind of person he was becoming without even realizing it. But before the teenager could respond, the man placed a business card on the counter. Take some time to think it over, he said. We'd love for you to meet with my father and see if this opportunity feels right to you. He'd really appreciate it. As the man walked away, leaving the teenager standing there with a sense of disbelief, it became clear that this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a turning point, a moment where one act of kindness would ripple outward, changing everything the teenager thought he knew about the world. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. The next day, when the teenager went to meet with the elderly man, he walked into the small office building where the man worked. The office was modest, but there was something welcoming about it. A small desk, family photos on the wall, and a well-worn chair where the elderly man sat, waiting. He greeted the teenager with the same warm smile he had shown the day before, but this time, there was a sense of purpose in the air, as though the weight of what was about to happen had begun to sink in. The conversation that followed was both heartwarming and revealing. The elderly man shared more about his life, his struggles, and his passion for the work he had spent decades building. He spoke of the importance of helping others, of how kindness had been a cornerstone of his life, even when times had been tough. The teenager, in turn, shared his own story about the hardships he faced, about how the pressure of growing up in a world that didn't always seem to care weighed on him every day. And yet, despite everything, there was still a part of him that wanted to believe in the good in people. A part of him that longed for connection, for a sense of belonging in a world that often felt cold. But just as the teenager was starting to feel like this could be the opportunity he had always dreamed of, something unexpected happened. The elderly man grew quiet, as though he were contemplating something deeply important. And then, in a voice that was softer than before, he said something that would completely change the teenager's perspective on everything. You know, the elderly man began slowly, life isn't just about opportunities or chances. It's about the people we meet along the way. And sometimes, the most important lessons don't come from what we do, but from what others do for us. Your kindness yesterday, it wasn't just a moment of helping someone in need. It was a reminder of what truly matters. I've spent my whole life focused on business, on success, but it's moments like yesterday that remind me of the bigger picture. You, my young friend, have shown me something I had forgotten. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The teenager could hardly believe what he was hearing. What had started as a simple gesture of kindness had already transformed into a deeper connection, one that was reshaping how both he and the elderly man viewed their lives. But what would happen next? Would this unexpected meeting lead to the life-changing opportunity that the man had hinted at? Or was there something even greater at play? A lesson about kindness, humanity, and connection that neither of them could have anticipated? Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you questioning the true power of small acts of kindness, and just how much they can shape the future in ways we can't always see coming. The following days felt like a blur. The teenager couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted in a way he didn't fully understand. It wasn't just a job offer or the strange feeling of being noticed by someone he barely knew, it was the way the elderly man's words had lingered in his mind. It's moments like yesterday that remind me of the bigger picture. The phrase echoed in his thoughts, tugging at something deep inside him. For a long time, he had been trying to make sense of his place in the world. He had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and promises of a brighter future often felt like distant dreams. Many of his friends had already given up on the idea of something better. They lived in the moment, the struggle for survival so real that thinking long term seemed like an impossible luxury. He had often found himself thinking that maybe this was just the way life was meant to be, an endless cycle of making do, of scraping by. But now, with the elderly man's words in his mind, the teenager began to wonder if there was something more to all of this, something more than just getting by. The offer to meet with the man and discuss a potential job had left him in a kind of stunned daze. It wasn't just the idea of working for someone important, it was the thought that this one small decision, a simple act of kindness, could open up a door to something completely new. Something that might change everything. Still, he wasn't entirely sure what to make of it. The man's family had seemed so genuine, but the teenager wasn't naive. Life didn't always hand out gifts like this for no reason. People didn't just go around offering life-changing opportunities to strangers, especially not someone like him. No, he had seen enough of life's harsh realities to be cautious. That evening, after finishing up his shift at the store, he sat down on the small couch in his apartment, staring out the window at the city lights that twinkled below. His mind raced as he thought about the conversation with the elderly man. The more he thought about it, the more the weight of what had happened began to settle in. This wasn't just a random encounter. Something bigger was at play here. But what? The next day, as he walked to the small office building where he was supposed to meet the man's father, a sense of nervous anticipation weighed heavily on his shoulders. It was early in the morning, the air still crisp from the night's chill, and the streets were quieter than usual. He kept replaying everything in his head, the offer, the words, the sincerity in the elderly man's voice. He couldn't help but feel a strange mix of hope and skepticism. Could one act of kindness really change everything for him? When he arrived at the office, he was greeted by the receptionist, who smiled warmly and gestured for him to take a seat. The office was quiet, with soft lighting and a faint smell of fresh coffee in the air. As he waited, he couldn't help but feel like he was stepping into a world that was completely different from the one he knew, a world where people had resources, opportunities, and connections. A world where the struggles he faced every day were just distant memories, the kind of thing people could forget once they'd made it. His thoughts were interrupted when the elderly man appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up when he saw the teenager. He motioned for him to come in. Come in, he said warmly. I'm glad you could make it." The teenager followed him into a small office, where the elderly man gestured for him to sit across from him at a worn wooden desk. It was clear this man was no stranger to hard work. The office, though modest, was filled with books and papers that spoke of years of experience and dedication. There were no signs of luxury, but there was a quiet, unassuming sense of accomplishment. "So," the elderly man began, his voice calm but with a hint of excitement, "I'm glad you came today. I've been thinking a lot about the way you helped me the other day. It wasn't just about the groceries, you know. It was about something deeper, something that not everyone possesses." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands thoughtfully. "You showed me something I haven't seen in a long time, genuine kindness. It's rare, you know. But it's also valuable." The teenager shifted in his seat, unsure of what to say. The words sounded almost too flattering, too good to be true. He had done something simple, something anyone would have done if they had taken a moment to consider it. But the elderly man didn't seem to see it that way. "Why are you offering me this opportunity?" the teenager finally asked, his voice quieter than he intended. "I mean, I'm just a kid from the neighborhood. I don't have the experience you're looking for. I'm not some big shot, I'm just me." The elderly man smiled gently. "You see, that's the thing. Experience can be taught, but character? That's something you either have or you don't. And what you did for me, that's the kind of character I'm talking about. People with that kind of heart are the ones who make a difference. They're the ones who build something real." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I can teach you what you need to know." What I can't teach is how to be a good person. You've already shown me that. The teenager's mind raced. He wanted to believe the man. He wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was his shot, a chance to step out of the life he had always known and into something better. But doubt gnawed at him. What if it was all too good to be true? What if he was being taken advantage of in some way he couldn't even see? The last thing he wanted was to trust someone only to end up burned in the end. Before he could respond, the elderly man continued, his tone now more serious. I'm not asking you to make any decisions today. Take your time. Think about it. But I do want you to know something. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the teenager's with an intensity that was hard to ignore. This opportunity? It's more than just a job. It's a chance to change the direction of your life. And I wouldn't offer it to just anyone. The teenager was silent for a moment, the weight of the words sinking in. The room felt thick with the quiet tension, and for the first time, he began to understand that this wasn't just a random offer. It was something bigger, something that could define the rest of his life. But that was also what scared him the most. The pressure of it all. The unknown. Do you trust me? The elderly man asked, breaking the silence. I know that's a big question, but if you do, I promise you I'll help you in ways that will make you proud. The teenager's heart raced. Could he trust this man? Was this really the opportunity he had been waiting for, or was it a trap, something too good to be true? He had heard too many stories of people getting caught in the web of false promises, of finding themselves in situations that had started with good intentions but ended in heartbreak. I'm not sure, the teenager said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. I want to trust you, but I don't know if I can. The elderly man nodded, his expression softening. That's fair. But sometimes trust is something that has to be earned. And I'm willing to earn it. One step at a time. The conversation shifted after that, and the teenager found himself thinking over every word the elderly man had said. The more he thought about it, the more conflicted he became. Should he take a chance on this opportunity? Should he walk away? The thought of change, real change, was both thrilling and terrifying. As he left the office that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of something monumental. But what that something was, he couldn't yet say. The seeds of doubt were still planted deep inside him, growing with every step he took. And yet, there was a flicker of hope that he couldn't quite extinguish. The next morning, something unexpected happened. He woke up to find a letter in the mailbox, addressed to him in the same handwriting as the business card he had received. The letter contained only a few short lines, but they were enough to make his heart skip a beat. Your time is coming. Trust in what you've started. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt a chill run down his spine. Who had sent this letter? And why did it feel like the pieces of his life were slowly, mysteriously, starting to fall into place? One thing was certain, whatever was coming, it was going to change everything. But whether it would be for the better or whether he would regret it remained a question that only time could answer. And time was something he had precious little of. The days that followed were a blur of unease and anticipation. Every time the teenager went to bed, his mind raced, replaying everything that had happened: the encounter with the elderly man, the job offer, the strange letter. Each new twist in the story seemed to lead to another question, another layer of mystery. The tension built inside him, a knot tightening with every passing moment. Was this truly the opportunity of a lifetime? Or was he walking straight into something he couldn't see yet? His phone buzzed late one evening, interrupting his thoughts as he sat alone in his small apartment. It was a text from the man's son, the one he had briefly met in the office the other day. Your decision has been noticed. They're expecting you tomorrow. Be ready. The message was cryptic, brief, and unsettling. Who was they? Why did it sound like he was being called into something bigger than he could understand? His pulse quickened. Everything had felt so normal at first, the simple act of helping the elderly man, the conversation that followed, the letter that had arrived at his door. But now, as the stakes seemed to rise higher with every word, a creeping doubt filled the pit of his stomach. What had he gotten himself into? The next morning, he made his way to the office with a heavy heart. His steps were slower than usual, his thoughts louder. He had spent hours the night before going over his options, thinking of everything he had to lose. He could walk away from it all, pretend nothing had happened, and go back to his normal life. He knew that path all too well. It was safe, predictable, and comfortable. But the other option, the one he couldn't quite shake off, was pulling him in. It was risky. It was unknown. But it was also full of possibilities. When he arrived at the office, the receptionist greeted him without much fanfare, her smile polite but distant. Something felt different today. The usual warmth of the office had been replaced by a coldness that was hard to ignore. As he made his way up to the elderly man's office, the weight of what he was about to face seemed almost suffocating. The door to the office opened, but it wasn't the elderly man who greeted him. Instead, a woman stood in the doorway, a woman he had never seen before. She was tall, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him, and her expression was unreadable, almost calculating. "Come in," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "We've been expecting you." He hesitated for a moment, but then followed her inside. The elderly man wasn't in the office, but there was an unmistakable air of authority in the room. The walls were adorned with sleek modern art, and the furniture looked expensive but uninviting. The woman motioned for him to sit, her eyes never leaving his. "You've made an impression on my father," she began, her voice cool but with an underlying tension. "He speaks highly of you, and that's not something he does lightly. You've shown potential more than we expected." The teenager shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to make sense of what was happening. This was not the conversation he had been prepared for. There was a weight in her words that made him feel small, insignificant. "I just helped him with his groceries," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I didn't do anything special." The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No, you did more than that. You impressed him with something far more valuable, your willingness to help without expecting anything in return. In this world, that's rare." She paused, watching him closely. "But that's not why you're here." At that moment, the door behind her opened, and the elderly man stepped into the room. His presence was different today. He seemed more serious, more authoritative, like a different person entirely. His usual warmth was replaced with a quiet intensity that made the teenager's pulse quicken. "I see you've met my daughter," the elderly man said, his voice low. "Good. Now we can talk business." The teenager's heart skipped a beat. Business? What business was he talking about? This wasn't what he had signed up for. The tension in the room was thick, and it felt like the walls were closing in on him. He had come here hoping for some clarity, but instead, he was being dragged deeper into a world he didn't understand. The woman sat down across from him, her posture rigid and controlled. "You're not just here to work for us," she said. "We're offering you something much more significant. Something that will change everything. But there are rules. Boundaries. And if you choose to accept this opportunity, you'll have to prove yourself." The teenager looked back and forth between the two of them, his mind spinning. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky now. "What is this really about?" The elderly man's eyes softened, but his tone remained serious. "It's about power. Influence. The kind of things that can shape your future if you're willing to take the leap. This isn't just a job, son. It's a chance to become part of something much bigger than yourself. And you'll have to earn it every step of the way." His words hit the teenager like a punch to the gut. What was he hearing? This didn't sound like the kind of opportunity he had imagined. This sounded like something dangerous, something that would demand everything from him. He had always believed that hard work and honesty were the keys to success, but now it felt like he was standing at a crossroads where those values might not even matter. The woman spoke again, her voice cutting through his thoughts. We have connections, resources, people who can make things happen in ways you can't even begin to understand. But we're selective. We don't just give this kind of power away. We need to know if you have what it takes to play the game. The teenager's stomach twisted. Power? Connections? Was this what it all came down to? He had never wanted anything like this. All he had wanted was a chance, just a shot at something better. He had never dreamed that it would come with a price tag this steep. Why me? He asked, barely able to form the words. Why are you offering me this? I'm just some kid who helped you with your groceries. The elderly man leaned in, his gaze piercing. Because you showed something we don't see often. You showed integrity. And that's rare in a world like ours. We don't offer this to just anyone. But we think you might be different. The words echoed in his mind, the weight of the decision pressing down on him with every passing second. This wasn't just a simple job offer. This was something much bigger and much more dangerous than he could have ever anticipated. The room seemed to close in around him as the woman's voice broke the silence once more. You have one day to decide. If you walk away now, that's it. We won't come back. But if you choose to take the offer, you'll enter a world where things are never as simple as they seem. You'll have to decide if you're willing to pay the price. Are you ready for that? The teenager's heart raced, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. This was a turning point in his life, and he knew that whatever choice he made now would shape his future in ways he couldn't possibly understand. The question was, could he trust them? Could he trust this offer? Or was this the kind of opportunity that could swallow him whole? He stood up slowly, his knees shaky. I need some time, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can. I need time. The elderly man nodded, his expression unreadable. You have until tomorrow. Choose wisely. This is a once-in-a-lifetime chance, and you'll never get another one. As the teenager left the office, the weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders. He didn't know what to think anymore. What was he really being asked to do? What was the cost of entering this world? And more importantly, could he live with the consequences of the decision he was about to make? The question lingered in his mind as he walked down the cold, empty street. Tomorrow would bring answers that might change everything. But for now, all he had was uncertainty, and the haunting feeling that the path he was about to take could be far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The night felt unusually heavy as the teenager walked home, his steps slow and measured, his mind consumed by the words he had heard earlier that day. He couldn't shake the feeling that the offer, whatever it was, wasn't what it seemed. The idea of power, connections, and influence had all sounded so abstract, so distant, like a story someone might tell about the lives of the rich and famous. But now, it was real. It was tangible. And the more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. As he walked past familiar streets, the dim streetlights flickering above, his phone buzzed once again. He didn't recognize the number, but the message was clear. Don't trust them. His heart skipped a beat. The text was so blunt, so direct. It felt like someone had thrown cold water on his simmering doubts, making them boil over with a fresh surge of anxiety. The sender didn't identify themselves, but the urgency in the words was undeniable. What was this? A warning? A threat? He glanced around nervously, half expecting someone to be watching him from the shadows. But there was nothing. No one. Just the quiet hum of the city and the weight of the message in his hands. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. The timing was too perfect. The message had come right after his conversation at the office, right after he had been left with more questions than answers. Could this be some kind of trap? Were the elderly man and his daughter not who they said they were? Or was this text a last-ditch effort by someone trying to manipulate him? Either way, something didn't add up. Without thinking, he called the number back. The phone rang several times before it was picked up, and for a moment, all he could hear was heavy breathing on the other end. Then, a voice, low and gravelly, came through. "You have no idea what you're getting into," the voice said. "They're not who they say they are. You've got to get out now, before it's too late." The teenager's pulse quickened. The voice wasn't familiar, he had never heard it before, but the words felt like a punch to the gut. Who was this? And why were they warning him? The voice continued, barely a whisper now, as if someone might be listening in. "You don't know what they do. You don't know who they're connected to. You think you're being offered a job? You're being recruited, and not for what you think. Trust no one. Leave before tomorrow. It'll be too late if you don't." The line went dead before he could respond. He stared at the phone, his hand trembling. Was this just some prank? Or was someone really trying to warn him about the elderly man and his daughter? He had no answers, just a growing sense of dread. The world he had been offered, a world of power and influence, now felt more like a trap than an opportunity. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the fear that was creeping up his spine. He couldn't make decisions based on anonymous texts, could he? He needed answers. He needed to know the truth before he could make any choice. That night he barely slept. Every creak of the building, every distant sound from the street below, set his nerves on edge. He tossed and turned, the events of the past few days replaying in his mind, each detail becoming more and more distorted, as if the story was constantly shifting beneath him. Was this real? Was he truly on the verge of something that could change his life, or was he about to walk straight into a dangerous game he didn't understand? The morning came far too soon. When he woke, the weight of the decision still pressed down on him, suffocating him with its uncertainty. He had planned to go to the office, to meet with the elderly man and his daughter, but now, something felt wrong. The warning from the mysterious voice was still fresh in his mind, and the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. What if this was a setup? What if the whole thing was a scheme, a trap to draw him in and take advantage of him? He grabbed his phone, looking through the messages once again. There was nothing from the elderly man's family, nothing that would help him understand what was going on. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, something crucial. His hand hovered over the phone, as if he might call the elderly man and confront him, but something held him back. Was this his chance to get answers? Or was it too risky? In a sudden burst of frustration, he slammed his fist against the table, startling himself. No more second guessing. He couldn't keep living in this state of uncertainty. He had to go and confront them, even if it meant facing whatever he was so afraid of. The office was quiet when he arrived. The usual hustle and bustle was replaced by an eerie calm. The receptionist wasn't at her desk, and there was no sign of anyone else. He hesitated for a moment before walking toward the elevator, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. When the doors opened to the office floor, he was met with an unsettling silence. Something didn't feel right. He walked down the corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. The door to the elderly man's office was ajar, but no one was inside. He pushed it open slowly, his breath shallow as he peered into the room. It was just as he had left it the day before, except for one glaring difference. A large, manila envelope was sitting on the desk, waiting for him. The envelope was sealed, and there was no note, no indication of who had left it. His instincts told him to turn around and walk out. This was getting too strange, but something inside him wouldn't let him leave just yet. He picked up the envelope carefully, his fingers trembling as he slid open the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and scrawled across it, in messy handwriting, were the words, "They're watching you. Don't trust them. Get out now, while you still can." The words hit him like a thunderclap. His stomach twisted in knots, and the world around him seemed to spin. Who had left this message? The mysterious voice from the phone call? But how could they know what was happening? How could they know what he was doing? And why was this all happening now? Just as he was about to turn and leave, the door behind him creaked open, and he spun around to see the elderly man standing there, his face unreadable. He looked different today, more distant, colder, as if something about him had shifted overnight. "You got my message?" the elderly man said quietly, his voice too calm for the tension in the room. "I wasn't sure if you'd come, but I'm glad you did." The teenager's heart raced, a mix of fear and confusion flooding him. "What is this?" he demanded. "What is going on here? I don't understand." The elderly man's gaze flickered to the envelope in the teenager's hand, then back to his face. "You don't understand yet. But you will. Soon enough." The words hung in the air, charged with a promise of something dark and dangerous. The teenager felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. This was no longer just about a job offer. This was something deeper, something that involved more than he had ever imagined. And then, before he could speak another word, the man added, "But you're too late. You've already crossed the line. Now you're in this whether you like it or not." Everything he thought he knew, the kindness, the promises of opportunity, had suddenly unraveled before him. He wasn't just a participant in a story. He was the prey. And now, there was no going back. The words "too late" hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The teenager's pulse hammered in his chest as the elderly man's cold, calculating gaze seemed to pierce through him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, but nothing felt real anymore. He had walked into this office with nothing more than a simple act of kindness, and now, in the span of a few days, it had all spiraled into something he couldn't control. He had trusted them, trusted the elderly man's sincerity, believed the promises of opportunity. And now, it felt like the entire world was collapsing around him. The elderly man stepped further into the room, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving the teenager. "You thought this was a simple offer," he said, almost with pity in his voice. "But it was never about a job. It was never about groceries or charity. This was always about you." The teenager's mind reeled. "What do you mean?" "I don't understand." The elderly man's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "You were chosen, long before you ever helped me with my groceries. You've been part of this plan from the very beginning, whether you knew it or not." Confusion and anger bubbled inside him. "No, that's impossible. You can't be serious. I'm just a regular guy. I didn't even know who you were until a few days ago." But the man wasn't listening anymore. He walked over to his desk, motioning for the teenager to follow. As he did, the elderly man pulled out a small, black binder from a drawer, the kind that looked ordinary, but the teenager could feel the weight of it. It wasn't just paperwork, it was something more. "The moment you helped me," the elderly man continued, "we saw something in you. A willingness to act, to help, without asking for anything in return. That's rare. And that's exactly what we need in people like you." The teenager's stomach churned. He opened his mouth to argue, to scream that this wasn't right, but the words caught in his throat. The reality of the situation was sinking in. He had walked into this office hoping for a chance to escape his struggles, but now it was clear that this wasn't about a job or a better life. This was a game, a dangerous game that he hadn't understood the rules to. "I don't want any part of this," he said, his voice shaking. "Whatever it is, I want out." The elderly man's expression hardened. "That's not how this works. Once you've been chosen, you don't get to walk away. Not unless you're willing to pay the price. But you'll learn that soon enough." A sudden chill swept through the room, and the teenager's thoughts raced. Was this really happening? How had he gotten so caught up in something like this? His mind flashed back to the mysterious warning, the text he had received late last night. "They're watching you," it had said. Who had sent it? Someone who knew the truth. Or was it just another part of this twisted web? Before he could process everything, the door to the office swung open with a sharp creak, and in walked the woman, the elderly man's daughter. She had a look on her face that was unreadable, but the teenager could sense the tension in the air. Something had shifted, and now, he wasn't sure if he was being manipulated by both of them, or if there was something else at play entirely. She walked past him, giving him a cold, almost amused glance before turning her attention to her father. "He's not going to walk away, is he?" she asked, her tone clipped. The elderly man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened the binder and began flipping through the pages. "He's been given a choice," he said. "He can join us and become part of something bigger. Or he can walk away and never know what could have been." The woman's gaze flickered toward the teenager. A glint of something he couldn't quite place in her eyes. "You should join us," she said. "There's power, influence, opportunities you can't even dream of. You'll have the world at your feet. But don't think you're the only one who could have been chosen. We have other options. Other people." The teenager's mind reeled. This was far more than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about helping an elderly man anymore. It wasn't just about a job. This was about a world that was hidden from the public, a world where power and control were the currency. And now, they were offering him a place in it, a place that came with a price. But then, something in his gut told him to push back, to fight. He didn't know what was real anymore, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let them take control of his life without understanding exactly what was at stake. "I don't care about any of that," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't care about power. I just want to know the truth." "Why me?" The elderly man's face darkened, and for a moment, the woman's eyes flickered with an emotion that could only be described as something close to regret. But then, just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by the calculating coldness that had been there from the start. "You were never just anyone," the elderly man said, his voice low, almost sinister. "You're part of a much bigger plan. Your actions were never a coincidence. We've been watching you long before you even knew who we were." The woman stepped forward now, her voice smooth and controlled. "It's not just about helping someone. It's about being someone who can be trusted, who can be controlled. We needed someone like you to take the next step, to move forward with our agenda." And then, with a sudden, startling clarity, it all clicked into place. The oddness of the offer, the mysterious warning, the sense of being pulled into something bigger than he could understand. He wasn't just an innocent bystander caught up in their scheme. He was the scheme. He had been chosen, not for his kindness, but because they had seen something in him all along: a vulnerability, a willingness to believe, a willingness to help. And now, they needed that. But before he could respond, before he could confront them with everything he had learned in the past few days, the room suddenly plunged into darkness. The lights flickered, then died completely, leaving the teenager in a cold, suffocating blackness. His heart raced, panic rising in his chest. He heard movement, soft, deliberate footsteps before a voice whispered from the shadows. "It's over. You don't get to choose anymore." The voice wasn't the elderly man's. It wasn't the woman's. It was someone else, someone completely different. Someone he hadn't seen before. The realization hit him with a gut-wrenching force. The game had changed again. The stakes had been raised. And just as he felt the cold hand of fear close around him, a soft beeping noise filled the air. A single light flickered back on in the corner of the room, revealing a security camera on the ceiling. A red light was flashing. "You were never supposed to know this," the new voice said, its tone full of finality. But now that you do, it's too late. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed open with terrifying force, and he spun around to find himself facing a different man, entirely tall, menacing, with a look of cold authority in his eyes. "Don't worry," the new man said, smiling darkly. "You'll get answers soon enough. But first, we need to make sure you understand one thing. You're not leaving. Ever." And then everything went black. The world around him swirled in darkness, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still alive or if his body had simply shut down from the sheer intensity of everything he had just experienced. The cold grip of fear tightened around his chest as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. The voice in the shadows, the sudden appearance of the man with the cold eyes, the flashing security camera, it all felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His thoughts were a blur, and he couldn't remember when the last moment of clarity had slipped away from him. The truth, the full weight of it, was unraveling before him, but it was slipping through his fingers like sand. He had been chosen, manipulated, pulled into a web far beyond his understanding. And now? Now, there was no escape. The door had been closed behind him, and the only way out seemed to be a road he couldn't see. Then, the dark silence broke. The flickering light in the corner intensified, casting long shadows on the walls. His breathing came in sharp, ragged gasps as he tried to push himself up from the floor. The moment he moved, pain shot through his body, his head, his chest, his arms. Everything felt like it had been bruised, like he'd been tossed around by something far stronger than him. But he wasn't going to just lie there. He couldn't. His heart was still beating. He was still alive. That had to mean something. A figure appeared before him, blocking the light for a brief moment, casting an even darker shadow over him. The man from before, the one with the cold, authoritarian eyes, stepped forward, his tall frame looming over him like a predator. The teenager's mind scrambled for answers. Who was this man? What did they want from him? "You're still here, I see," the man said, his voice smooth and unnervingly calm. "You don't seem surprised, though. You knew this was coming, didn't you?" "All along." The teenager didn't respond. What could he say? What could he even ask? The warning signs had been there, hadn't they? The cryptic messages. The strange office. The way everything had felt off, even before he'd met the elderly man. The pieces had never quite fit, but he had ignored them. He had wanted so badly to believe that it was just a job. That this was his chance to finally break free of the life he had known. But now, the truth was undeniable. He had been a pawn all along. "You probably thought you had a choice," the man continued, crouching down to meet his eyes. "That you could choose whether to join us or not. But that's not how this works. Not for you, not for anyone. You never had a choice. You were always part of the plan." The teenager shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and frustration clouding his mind. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile, almost like he found the question amusing. "It's simple. You're here because you were meant to be. You showed potential. You have something we need, something that can't be found in ordinary people." He paused, looking over the teenager as if weighing him. "We've been watching you for a long time. We know your weaknesses, your strengths, your fears, your hopes. It's all part of the game." The teenager's head spun. "I don't get it. Why me? Why any of this?" The man straightened up, his gaze unblinking. "Because you're special. And because, like all things in this world, nothing happens by accident. You were placed in that grocery store at that exact time for a reason. You helped him because you were meant to. It was never about a simple act of kindness. It was a test, and you passed. A test." The words hung in the air like a hammer striking steel. A test? That's what it had all been. A game? He couldn't wrap his mind around it. Who are you? The teenager asked, the question tumbling out of him before he could stop it. What is this? Who do you really work for? The man's expression remained unchanged, but something dark flickered in his eyes. We are not so easily defined. We work for ourselves. For the future. We believe in order, control, and power. You may think we're just a small, isolated group, but the truth is much bigger. You're only seeing a small part of it. The teenager's head felt like it was about to explode. This couldn't be real. How could it be? This couldn't be the life he had been brought up to believe in. This wasn't the world he knew. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice shaky but defiant. There's still time. You don't have to drag me into your plans. The man's smile deepened, as if he were savoring the moment. You still don't understand. You never had the option to say no. You've been marked. You think you can escape now, but that would only make things worse for you. As the words settled in, a door to the office swung open again. The elderly man entered, his figure emerging from the darkness, followed by his daughter. The tension in the room thickened. It was all coming full circle, and the teenager could no longer deny the gravity of the situation. We've waited long enough, the elderly man said, his voice cold and stern. We thought you might take a different path. But you've already crossed the line. Now you'll see things for what they truly are. For the first time in days, the teenager felt an overwhelming urge to run. But his legs felt like lead. The room seemed to close in on him. Escape was no longer an option. He had no idea who these people really were or what they were capable of. All he knew was that his life had just been flipped upside down, and he didn't know how to get it back. Suddenly, the elderly man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, unmarked envelope. He handed it to the teenager without a word. Take it, he said. The teenager took the envelope in trembling hands, unsure of what to expect. Inside, there was nothing but a single piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, reading the words scrawled across the page, "Welcome to the game. There is no turning back. What you do from here on out will define you. Your future is in your hands, but remember this, there is always a price to pay." His heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. This was it. This was the moment when everything changed. There was no going back to his old life. He wasn't going to be able to walk away from this. Not anymore. The woman stepped forward now, her voice smooth as silk. It's time for you to make a choice. What happens next is up to you. The teenager took a deep breath, his chest tight. He had always believed that he could carve his own path in life, that his actions and decisions were his own to make. But now, it felt like every choice had been taken from him. The weight of the letter in his hand, the uncertainty of the road ahead, it was almost too much to bear. But then, in a flash of clarity, something shifted within him. He wasn't just going to lie down and let these people control his life. Not without a fight. They might have manipulated him, chosen him, tested him, but he still had his own will. He still had the ability to make his own decisions. With a sudden, unexpected move, the teenager shoved the envelope back into the elderly man's hands, stepping away. No, he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. I'm not playing your game. I'm not going to be your pawn. I don't care what you think you can offer me. I don't need any of it. The elderly man's face tightened with a mixture of surprise and anger. But before he could respond, the door to the office flung open once again. This time, it wasn't just one figure, it was several. People in suits, faces hidden behind dark sunglasses, their movements quick and efficient. They didn't look like they were here to negotiate. The man with the cold eyes stepped forward, as if this was all part of the plan. It's over, he said, his voice final. You should have accepted the offer when you had the chance. Now you'll pay the price for your defiance. But the teenager was no longer afraid. The fear that had gripped him for so long, the uncertainty, was replaced by something else, a quiet resolve. He had no idea how he would get out of this, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let them control him. He wouldn't let them win. In that moment, as the shadows closed in around him, the teenager took one final step. He turned and bolted for the door, adrenaline flooding his veins. There were no more games. No more decisions made for him. His future might have been stolen from him, but he still had his spirit. And that was something they couldn't take. As he ran, the footsteps behind him grew louder. The game, as they called it, wasn't over yet. But he had just rewritten the rules. And in that, he found a kind of power, one that no one, no matter how powerful they were, could ever take from him. The chase had begun. And this time, it was on his terms.